Appreciate the chance to be back in Des Moines. Last time I was here at your association meeting, I didn't even believe in airborne spread of PRRS. So things have really changed. I'll show you why. So I'm going to talk about that. We're going to focus on keeping disease off the farm, but this is a project that's been running for about 3 years now, and it involves a whole bunch of really important people. You see their names here on the slide. Especially I'd like to recognize some really good veterinarians from southern Minnesota, Gordon Sprunk from Pipestone, Darwin Reichs, Swine Vet Center, and Paul Roon from Fairmont, who have helped me take some of the research and put it into the field. I don't like to sit in the laboratory and count amino acids and things like that. I like to go to the farm and try to solve problems. So with having these relationships with these really good veterinarians helps me out to get on the farm. So I appreciate the time with you today. And I'm willing to take any of your questions. So if you feel free, just stand up and holler, or we can wait till the end, whatever you're more comfortable with. I want to be transparent and disclose where I get my funds. Also, I want to recognize and acknowledge and say thank you to these organizations that have provided funding or in-kind resources. A lot of funding from National Pork Board, a lot of funding from our state pork board. We appreciate all of that, as well as the USDA PRRS Cap 1 and 2 projects, but a lot of other really important people and groups listed here on the slide. I'm the director of what we call the Swine Disease Eradication Center, and that's a group at Minnesota that we've organized to bring the industry and the veterinary school closer together. And you can see some of the groups here on the slide that have provided funding as well as in-kind resources, and I want to thank and recognize these groups here. They're all very important. They provide funding for us to support our graduate students, to support our research farm, and as well as do some pilot studies in between the granting cycles. So these groups are really important. And finally, just for transparency, I'm going to talk about air filtration quite a bit today, but I want you to know that I do not receive royalties or commissions on the sales of filters or equipment. I hold no patents on filtration inventions, and I have no contracts with filtration companies. And so the research that I do on air filtration is funded by the National Pork Board, the Minnesota Pork Board, the groups you saw there before. But I do thank the filter companies for supporting some of the in-kind resources. Okay, so the topics I'm going to focus on today are two. I'm not going to focus on PRRS virus, although I'll also talk about Mycoplasma pneumoniae, another airborne virus, or bacteria actually, another airborne disease. I'm going to say, ask how does PRRS virus spread between farms, and specifically what's the role of aerosol transmission in the spread of the disease, and how can we stop it? That's what's really important for you folks in the audience. It doesn't really matter if it happens. You got to be able to stop it. That's for sure. And what is the role of air filtration in that? We have to be able to stop it. And I'll tell you ahead of time, this is the only way I've found to stop the airborne spread of this virus. So that's one take-home message right away. But PRRS virus spreads by multiple ways. And I just made a little table this morning in my hotel room just summarizing the different routes that the virus moves between farms and some specific examples, as well as what can we do about it? How do we stop it? Well, of course, you can move the virus with infected pigs or contaminated semen, but we're very familiar with now. The genetic companies have done a really good job in cleaning up their herds as well as their boar studs. But you should always still quarantine and test your animals. You should use your veterinarian to do vet-to-vet communications between a seed stock producer or an AI center veterinarian and your farm, so you know what's coming down the pipeline. Fomites, those are inanimate objects such as boots, coveralls, containers. Basically, disinfection is a very good way to eliminate PRRS virus from the surfaces of these inanimate objects or fomites. The one I use on my research site is a Synergize product that I think you're mostly familiar with at 1 ounce per gallon. Personnel, people. People can't carry the virus in their upper respiratory tract, but they can carry it on their hands. So if you handle infected pigs and you don't wash them, for example, and you go and handle negative pigs, you will transmit that virus from your hands to those negative pigs. Kind of common sense. Okay? But you don't carry it up in your nose or up in the oral pharynx or your mouth area. But it's your hands. And there are various entry protocols, shower in, shower out, one-night downtime. But even simple things like changing boots and coveralls and washing your hands is enough to break the cycle of the virus between a contaminated group and a naive group. Trucks, transport vehicles, obviously contaminated trailers. That's a lot of common sense. Dirty trailer, you put in clean pigs, and those pigs can get infected. Not that surprising. But it's very easy, really, to clean up these trailers. We know, again, the disinfectants to use. The synergized product is what we use on our farm. But getting those trailers dry is really important so that this virus kind of turns into a saltine cracker and just kind of crunches up and goes away. So it's really easy to kill this virus if you use the right disinfectant and you use the proper drying protocol. Bugs can move the virus around, specifically mosquitoes and houseflies. But you can control those if you want to use screens, of course, insecticides, habitat management, basic things like that. Obviously, we're not going to worry about these types of vectors during this time of year, and they're probably the least important of all the vectors that I list for you here. Airborne. Airborne spread is real. I'll show you an example of that. And what I mean by airborne is bioaerosols, so aerosols that come from an infected barn, air that's exhausted from a contaminated group of pigs. Those types of aerosols contain pathogens, and they can move from farm to farm. And again, air filtration is really the only way to control this route of the spread. And I'll show you some data to support that. So you can see how the virus moves all around. The good news is we know exactly how it moves now. There's no more mystery of how this thing moves between farms. All right. So before we jump into some research on filtration and other routes of biosecurity in our research farm and then go out into the field and show how this virus can move and how we can stop it in the field with air filtration, I want to show you a little study that we just finished last October looking at this question: how far can PRRS virus and mycoplasma travel in the air? I'm not sure if you can see this that good in the back row, but this is a Google map of our research site. So here's our research farm right here. It's got a number of buildings on it. I'll talk about it in a moment. But we want to see how far these pathogens could travel in the air. And so we set up various sampling points. You can see 1 mile north, 2 miles north, 3 miles north, 4 miles north. And basically, based on the prevailing wind direction, every morning we'd go sit out at a certain point and collect air samples and see if we could find the virus. Okay? So for example, if the wind was blowing from the northwest, we'd start down here in the southeast, 4 miles, actually longer than 4 miles away by the crow flies, and collect air, and we collect air here, here, and here. We'd test it for PRRS virus, we tested for mycoplasma. What did we learn? Well, we found a few positive samples. Here again is our source farm. And again, this was basically 300 crow-finish pigs in a continuous flow building in a fan-ventilated barn. You can see where we found live PRRS virus. Basically right as far as 9.1 kilometers, which is 5.7 miles. Okay, so the virus was still alive at that point. It could infect pigs, and we could actually count how many viruses were in that little air sample. You can see we also found it at shorter distances from the herd, but that was as far as we looked. We didn't go really any farther. So we don't really know how far it can go, but we know for sure it can go almost 6 miles. Same with mycoplasma. Here again is our source point, and you can see we found mycoplasma out to, again, about the same distance. Mycoplasma was also live at that point. So both of these agents can travel long distances in a viable form, in a living form, over the countryside. Okay? So there's no question anymore if airborne spread happens. It's probably just how often does it happen, and how far can these agents go. And if the landscape is right, this was a very flat landscape. There was very little elevation differences between these sampling points. You can see how far this can go, and probably even farther. Okay?
This is all from 300 pigs. It wasn't from you guys mixed virus from a larger quantity or something like that? Or?
Right. Right. This was all from 300 pigs that ran in a continuous flow cycle that we'd inoculated experimentally 3 years prior. So the thing was just cooking.
A large corporate site of 8,000 finishing pigs would be quite a bit further.
Yeah, that's a very good assumption. Yep. Yep. Yeah, this is a very small population. But it's got the right virus. I think that's an important point, too, is this was what we call the Minnesota 184 virus that we've used extensively in our research farm. I don't think all viruses are created equal when they come to airborne transmission. We've proven that with a small subset of viruses. Some viruses just have the ability to go long distances, others don't. Okay. What time of the year did we do that? We did it in October of last year. We did it for a 21-day period of time from October 2nd to the 22nd. And we sampled roughly, I think we started about 5:30 in the morning at that far point, took an air sample every half hour, and then moved closer to the barn. Any other questions about this? I just wanted to show you that there are data that support this does travel in the air. You probably already knew that from your own experiences, but here's some proof for you. Okay? Yes, sir? Yeah, good question. What's the weather conditions that were going on during this? I'll show you some of that in a second. Okay, good question. We're kind of still working on it, but I've got some ideas for you. All right. So, how do we go about changing the way we do research to better replicate what you folks deal with in the field? This was a question we had probably about 5 or 6 years ago, and we set up a different type of a research laboratory. This was a laboratory out in the farm. And this is what we call the production region model. And I'm going to use this model to kind of replicate maybe where some of you folks live, in a dense region of pork production, where there's a lot of people raising pigs in a neighborhood. Your neighbors might not be very far away from you. We wanted to know, in that type of a setting, could we understand how the virus moves between farms, and could we use our biosecurity protocols to see if we could stop it? Okay? So the objective of this study, which we basically just finished up, or are almost in the process of finishing, is a 3-year project, was to develop a model of a swine production region that's endemically infected with PRRS virus and mycoplasma, and see how these agents move around the neighborhood, and see if our biosecurity protocols work. We thought that airborne spread will be very important in moving around this little model. And as the gentleman asked, certain climate conditions would influence airborne spread. So this is kind of how we set it up, at least on the chalkboard to begin with. And this was 4 buildings at our research farm. There's no other pigs around this site for 10 miles. It's in west central Minnesota. They wouldn't let me put it in Iowa, so I moved it up to Minnesota. Basically, 4 buildings representing 4 farms, trying to serve as a neighborhood of pork production. 4 pork producers living close together to one another. One producer gets infected. One producer gets infected with Minnesota 184. Now this first year, we're just going to look at PRRS virus. The next 2 years, we're going to add mycoplasma to the mix. But first, let's focus on PRRS. 300 head, continuous flow, fan-ventilated building, gets infected with PRRS virus 184. The one I just showed you has the airborne capacity. Now, all around this neighborhood are 3 other pork producers with different levels of biosecurity, high, medium, and low. And let me show you what that means. Now, these buildings were placed this way to take advantage of prevailing winds moving from the northwest and then moving from the southeast, because we thought that airborne spread was going to be an important factor. Okay, this is how we defined each of those neighbors surrounding our source population. High, medium, and low. Okay? So what we've learned is we took all these different routes of spread that we just talked about, and we had individual biosecurity protocols that we tested for each one of them. Filtration, insect control, cleaning the trucks, disinfecting the incoming fomites, and personnel entry protocols such as changing coveralls and washing hands. And this facility has all of these biosecurity protocols put together in one facility. Right next to it is a medium, we call the medium level facility. And basically it's kind of an industry standard where things were a few years ago. where we didn't have any air filtration really in the industry, but we had control of these other routes. And then finally, in the upper corner, we had a low-level facility. This was the person with no rules, no biosecurity. You can see nothing happens here. We needed to show that spread would occur in the absence of intervention. Okay? This is what we learned. In that first high-level facility that had what we call a MERV 16 air filter, a filter from Camphil-Far, a company called Camphil-Far, we saw no evidence of infection during that entire year. So we raised pigs in this little model in this facility with an air filtration system, and no infection took place. Okay, so we stopped by the air, we stopped it by the people, we stopped by the trucks, we stopped it by all the incoming routes that we knew. Right next to it, only 4 meters away, 12 feet away, in our non-filtered building that had everything else but no filters, you see what we saw here. 31% of the time during that year, groups of pigs became infected. Okay? And we figured out that it was all by the airborne route. We actually captured the air entering the building, showed it had virus, and that virus infected the pigs 31% of the time, and we sequenced each of those viruses to show it was the same one. Okay? Now, in the fellow with no rules, you can see what happened over here. You can see that he broke frequently via multiple routes. And so what this is saying is, even though you might not be able to filter your facility, you can still do a pretty darn good job by preventing the routes of spread that you can control versus not doing anything at all for that entire year. So you can cut your breaks roughly in about half just by taking care of the bugs, taking care of the incoming objects, taking care of the people, to the trucks. You can't always stop the air in some of these cases, but you can stop other routes. Okay, so that was kind of an important take-home lesson that I saw from this first year of the study. Okay, so we figured out how the virus moves around. There weren't any cases where we couldn't find out how the virus got in. We figured them all out, and we were able to show differences between the buildings based on their biosecurity. Okay, does that make sense? That's year number 1. Year number 2, I said we used a different kind of a co-infection in our source population. Now our poor producer not only has Minnesota 184 PRRS virus, he's also got mycoplasma. That's much more realistic, isn't it, of a commercial grow-finish pig respiratory tract. We know that these two agents work together to make each other worse. So we wanted to make this a little bit more realistic of what you're dealing with in your finishers, because most farms that have PRRS also have mycoplasma. And we also want to see if the filters would work against other diseases. So this year, for the second year of the study, we didn't use this facility up in the corner. We'd kind of already proven what happens with that type of biosecurity. We focused only on airborne spread. And here again was our filtered facility and our non-filtered facility. So after the entire year, once again, using the same filter as we did the year prior, we saw no infection of that facility. There was no virus, and in this case, no mycoplasma that got into this facility. So the filters are starting to say they work against other things besides PRRS. Now, in the non-filtered building right next door, you can see here, we were under siege quite a bit. PRRS virus airborne spread, now mycoplasma airborne spread. Okay, so without the filters, even if you have really good biosecurity, these airborne diseases are still going to make their way in. What about year 3? Year 3, we changed things up a little bit on the filter side. We didn't think there was much value in repeating the MERV 16 filtration. Everybody, we'd done it, it works. It was quite expensive, and we wanted to see if other types of filters would work. So we worked with a company called Novico, who brought in another facility that they constructed. They have an antimicrobial filter, which doesn't work by capturing particles so much. It works by coating incoming particles with antimicrobial compounds and killing those pathogens before they get to the animals. Okay? It's a different strategy. We wanted to test it. So this was a new building that came to our farm. In this middle facility, which had our MERV 16 filter, we put in what we call a MERV 14 filter. That's a filter that's not as efficient. Air can flow through it better. And so you don't need as many filters in a building with a MERV 14 rating as you would with a MERV 16 rating, because the air can pass through easier. Okay? So we wanted to see if that filter would work as well as its predecessor, the 16. And we wanted to see how this new technology, which actually comes from Quebec, was going to stand up in this very aggressive model. What we learned was very pleasing. And we just finished this. We just actually got to the end of November was the final year of this project, although we're doing some side projects right now. In both of the filtered facilities, MERV 14 and antimicrobial, there was no evidence of pig infection. So those pigs raised throughout that whole year, all the groups of pigs that went through those two buildings, never got infected with either bug. And just like we'd seen before, in the non-filtered facility, airborne spread continued to occur. Okay? So it's very interesting for us that there were different types of filters that could be used for producers. And that's the nice thing, is I'd like to have a lot of options, because there's not one size that fits every building. All right. Now, the gentleman asked about weather. We were collecting via a weather station right on the farm meteorological data on a 5-minute basis, and we're able to look at what was it like outside when PRRS virus or mycoplasma was moving in the air. What was it like when it wasn't? And just for the sake of simplicity, because the picture's worth 1,000 words, there's a positive day. Okay? Cool, cloudy, foggy, humid, with a prevailing wind moving from our source population at a mild velocity towards those unfiltered facility. Okay? Kind of what you think. More common sense right here. This is what it was like outside when virus wasn't moving in the air. It was hot. It was real sunny, because this virus doesn't like UV light from the sun, can inactivate it. And we didn't have a prevailing wind. We didn't have a good, nice, moderate velocity directional wind flow from our source to our facilities downwind. Okay? Now, we're studying this a little bit more, and we're looking at actual numbers that fit these types of days. We're trying to get an idea of what are some numerical values for a high-risk day, or numerical values for a low-risk day. And it might develop into, you've heard of the UV index or the smog index. Maybe we'll develop a PRRS index. Based on certain weather parameters, we know that this is high risk today, people. If you don't have to move pigs, maybe wait a day. If you want to change your filters, wait till you got a day like this. Something like that. Maybe you can use that information to help you make decisions in regards to some of the things you do day to day. We're still working on that. Okay. So that whole year, before we get into the actual use of this technology on real farms, the production region model was 1,091 days long. It used 4,331 pigs, and we collected 22,512 samples as we tracked the virus between buildings over that 3-year period of time. And again, independent of filter type, there was no infection of the susceptible animals to either agent in those filtered barns. You can see what happened as just a summary: 53% infection rate in the non-filtered for PRRS, 46% infection rate in the non-filtered for mycoplasma. So I think I can clearly say, and I hope I've convinced you, that under the conditions of this model, well-controlled conditions, the filter technology is flawless, independent of filter type. Okay? So now we're just working with another type of filter for the next 6 months before we stop the farm. This is an electrostatic filter, so it's a different type of filter. So we're continuing to evaluate different types of filters to see if we can add to our arsenal. Okay? So that's another piece of information that we'll hopefully have before we get to into the summertime at the expo. So this is a very, very controlled setting. Obviously, they're very small populations, very small buildings, but it's a model. And the purpose was, as you know, to test whether this technology truly works. And I do believe it truly works. So where do we go next? Let's take it to the field. Now, I mentioned some practitioners early on: Gordon Spronk, Paul Ruin, Darwin Reichs. These guys are very aggressive. And they're always looking at the research and they're saying, what's new? What can I bring to my clients? Well, they got on this air filtration kick a long time ago, right when we were starting to do the first year of the study. And they started taking the technology and putting it into place in the bore studs. And the bore studs have worked extremely well under air filtration. There's a number of these studs that are 3 to 4 years post-application of filters. They're in very dense regions of swine production, southern Minnesota, Iowa. And these studs are staying free of PRRS virus, they're staying free of mycoplasma, and they're staying free of swine influenza virus. And in a bore stud, the filtration system is it's not that hard to install and manage because you've got a small building, you've got really well-trained people in the aspects of biosecurity. Okay? So the bore studs, it's worked extremely well. Some of you are involved with bore studs, perhaps, that have air filtration. You're getting your semen from those studs. Now, the sow farm, that's a little different. Again, I credit these practitioners in kind of leading the way in implementing this technology in the Midwest. And again, Darwin, Gordon, Paul. Sow farms are a little harder, as you know. They're bigger. They got more people. They have greater turnover. And there may not be quite the biosecurity mentality as there is in a bore stud. There's very well biosecure sow farms. I'm not being negative about that. But I think the biosecurity mentality in the bore stud is probably the highest level that I've dealt with in the system. Okay? So what we did is we started to put together a project to assess air filtration in large sow farms in swine-dense regions. And working together with, of course, I'm from Minnesota, Dr. Steve Pohl from South Dakota State University, who's here today. The clinics, Pipestone, Fairmont Swine Vet Center, and then a number of production systems that they work with. The objective was to see if this filtration technology works in the field. You know, all my little model stuff is kind of interesting and fun, but it doesn't mean anything if it doesn't work for you. Okay? So we have to test this now in the real world in dense, challenging conditions. So we have some criteria for farm selection. You know, you always have to have your selection criteria to pick your sites to come into your herd, into your study, so you properly analyze your treatments and your controls. So we're going to take filtered farms and non-filtered farms, but we're going to try to pick them so they're very similar. The only difference being that they're filtered or not. So we wanted large sow farms in this study. We wanted a history of breaking, perhaps on an annual basis, a new virus coming in roughly every year. We wanted them in dense regions of production, not something up in northern Minnesota. We wanted something down in southern Minnesota, in Iowa, where all the pigs are, to really challenge this. We wanted them also to have good biosecurity. We wanted them also to kind of biosecure their facilities like our medium-level facility. So they needed to understand transport biosecurity, personnel biosecurity, insects, fomites, all that stuff that we just talked about. I really wanted good biosecure farms, but had a history of breaking every year because of the area they were located in. We originally needed 6 filters and 18 non-filtered farms, treatments and controls. So 6 filtered farms, 18 non-filtered farms. We wanted to run this study over time, in this case 4 years, to really see whether this stuff works over time. And we're going to try to measure in the end if new virus gets in and how much does it cost. All right. So this is just to give you an idea of the farms in the study. We've got 10 filtered farms, and we've got 21 non-filtered farms. Okay, so we wanted 6 and 18, and we found 10 and 21. And just to show you how big they are, there's the average sow herd inventory. Here's their history of breaking. So about roughly one new virus about every year. And then here's the surrounding sites around these farms within a 3-mile radius. So they are indeed in swine-dense regions. They have a good history of breaking time and time again. So this is a picture courtesy of Dr. Spronk, just showing you one of the ways that the air filters are put into the facility. There's a number of ways to do this. This is just one example of some boxes, inlet boxes, constructed by Kent Unke and his crew, Biosecure Air Incorporated. and they have these filter boxes up in the attic. And the filter boxes have a pre-filter, just like we had in our little farm, which kind of keeps the bigger filter clean and helps it last a lot longer. So these are up in the attic. The dirty air potentially comes in through the soffits, and it's pulled through these filter boxes by negative pressure ventilation and filtered as it goes through down into the animal airspace. Okay? So that's one way of doing it. You can also build a filter bank in front of your cool cell and bring your air through filters there, through your cool cell, and into your herd. That way is a little bit more expensive because you have to build, typically you have to build an extension off your barn to put that filter bank up. One of the things we worry about a lot on these farms is backdrafting. Air coming through an idle fan. Air coming through cracks that's not filtered. So we have to do a lot of management on these farms to actually do a lot of caulking of cracks. We have to try to plug as many holes as we can. A technology I think is pretty interesting for, say, the stage 2 fans that kind of turn on, turn off, is this AP technology of backdrafting. They got a double shutter, backdrafting prevention. So maybe this is at the show. I'm not sure. Okay. This I think looks really neat, and we've tested this. And so what this is, it's got 2 shutters. So here's the outer shutter, which is kind of like a pre-filter. It's a plastic shutter to catch some of the big stuff. And then there's a nice aluminum shutter with some felt lining on the blades, that's spring-loaded. So there's 2 shutters, rather than just relying on one shutter to be closed tightly so air can't come through that idle fan. There's 2 now. We've tested this, and this actually works very, very well. So this is a technology I think will help reduce the risk of non-filtered air coming through a stage 2 fan as it idles on and off. What does it cost to filter one of these farms? Well, it depends. Depends on the type of filter you use, the ventilation system you've got currently, and then any other necessary modifications you bring in to your farm. You might want to put up a fence. You might want to put up a security camera system. You might need to do some remodeling, some new fans. So I can't really say that's exactly what it costs per farm. These are some examples I'll show you here from 4 farms, fairly large farms, where you can see there's a difference between those small farms, basically depending on the filter they used, what they needed to remodel their ventilation system, what other interventions did they bring into the project. So this is not necessarily just filter cost. This is filter cost, installation, materials, and some other costs that are involved in the project total. Okay? So you can see the good news is we've been able to cut that down and get that down lower than when we first began. So I think that's a good trend. But when you look at it, the cost of a PERS break can be over $500,000 for a 3,200 cell farm. So the prevention of one break actually ends up paying for the system. So it's just something to keep in mind. Everyone gets a little bit blown away by some of these numbers, but you just got to think about it. It's a technology. It's a way to reduce the risk of this happening. Okay? Progress so far. In our study that consists of the 10 filtered farms and the 21 non-filtered farms, this is what we've seen so far. The first year we started in September. We had 5 filtered farms. We just started the project. From September of 2008 to August of 2009, there was no virus introduction to these 5 farms. So the first year, everything stayed free of PERS virus introduction. The controls, look at the controls. 15 of the 21 non-filtered farms became infected during that year of time. Some of them became infected twice with different viruses. Okay? So there's a lot of difference here. Now, from September, the next year, to January, we did have 2 farms that were filtered with new viruses that was proven to come in. Based on some of the work we've been doing, we've been able to see that there have been some transport and some personnel breaches. And so we don't believe at this time that we have any evidence of filter failure. So it just shows you that the whole comprehensive plan is important. All those different routes of virus spread are important. We have to pay attention to them. But again, look what's happening with our control farms. We're picking up new viruses in our control farms much more frequently than we are in our filtered farms. And we'll continue to follow this along. And again, as I mentioned, it's a 4-year project, and we'll see what we learn at the end of the day. My prediction is there will be a significant reduction in breaks in filtered farms when compared to unfiltered farms in this swine dense region model. So what did we learn from all this? Well, in the field, a comprehensive approach to PRRS virus biosecurity is required. Everybody makes mistakes. And we have to continue to watch and educate and audit all of the different aspects going on at a farm in regards to biosecurity. And because of this human factor, filters cannot be considered as a silver bullet. You still have to have the whole program in place to stop the virus. But without filters, it's impossible to prevent airborne spread in swine-dense regions without them. You can't do it. Okay? It's just like our little production region model. That non-filtered farm, it broke throughout that year. It just happens over and over again. But the big picture, and I'm very optimistic about this disease and the progress we've made in the last few years, and I really appreciate working with the production systems and the practitioners that have helped me learn more about how to get this done in the field. The big picture that I'd like to leave you with is we now understand and we can impact PRRS virus transmission between farms. A few years ago, we didn't have a clue how this thing moved between farms. Now we understand how it works and we know how to stop it. Filtration is an effective tool. It's not a silver bullet. You still have to have a good comprehensive protocol to prevent virus from coming in via the other routes we've identified. But for the first time in the 20 years I've been working with PRRS virus, these farms under filtration can raise PRRS virus negative weaned pigs for downstream flow. That's something very, very different on a consistent basis. And so that's why I'm so optimistic. That's a hurdle we've really never been able to consistently to reach time and time again. But now I know we can.